Back in the fall of 1853, the Magnolia estate in Mississippi was basking in the glow of a wildly lucrative crop. The market value of white gold had exploded to historic peaks, making Jonathan Whitmore's sprawling acreage more violently fertile than ever before. Inside the suffocating walls of the main estate, frenzied arrangements were underway for a lavish banquet, designed to entertain 47 ruthless agricultural barons. These tycoons assembled to toast their blood-soaked opulence. It was a sickening jubilation honoring the dark machinery that minted their infinite fortunes, alongside cold calculations to spread their human trafficking enterprise. Yet deep within the sweltering cookhouse, where the cloying aroma of dark syrup tangled with the bitter bite of burning ash, a sinister agenda was quietly brewing. Samuel worked his calloused fingers with chilling mechanical accuracy, methodically pulverizing desiccated toxic blooms until they resembled the softest baking dust. His heavy stone grinding tools, hewn right from the local earth, hummed a lethal lullaby while the poisonous flora yielded their fatal venom to his methodical brutality. 43 agonizing years of existence had ravaged his flesh, leaving behind an endless tapestry of searing iron burns and deep knife wounds. Yet those battered fingers had never vibrated with such terrifying, unyielding resolve. Every microscopic flake of venom he manufactured bore the crushing burden of suppressed wrath, manifesting the hardened vengeance of a survivor, seizing his chance at divine retribution. The preparation quarters rested in pitch-black darkness. Only the unstable, dancing firelight radiating from the massive stone fireplaces illuminated the space designated to cook the impending banquet. Elongated silhouettes writhed across the scarred butcher blocks like the restless ghosts of the eternally victimized. Peering deeply into the darkness, Samuel hallucinated the vivid expressions of every single loved one stolen by Whitmore's unspeakable sadism. He visualized his wife Esther's tender grin right before her brutal torture, and his 14-year-old boy Marcus auctioned off like livestock, alongside his daughter Ruby. She had mysteriously evaporated under the cover of darkness after drawing the patriarch's predatory gaze, leaving behind nothing but a shredded garment and horrifying, unspoken suspicions. For 28 grueling years, he endured this culinary prison. 2 decades of forced obedience and hollow compliance echoed constantly through those stifling halls. All the while, his very spirit decayed like parched crops beneath a brutalizing sky, even as he arranged decadent spreads honoring their wicked fortunes. He painstakingly crafted extravagant dinners for their sinister boardroom negotiations, listening while breathing souls were bargained away like common farm animals. He presented fine dining at exclusive summits where these sociopaths plotted to drag their brutal human chains into pristine lands untouched by systemic torture. However, the approaching dawn promised a permanent shift, as his toxic brew was poised to deliver a horrifying message in their own dialect. The pulverized floral toxin piled up inside a modest clay dish, shimmering under the hearth sparks, much like innocent sweet granules kissing a wild inferno. Every microscopic speck harbored an ironclad vow of retribution, guaranteeing a final chapter dictated solely by Samuel's quivering fingertips rather than the oppressor's brutal lash. The monumental banquet was scheduled to kick off at dusk, a time when the opulent parlor would become choked with the absolute elite of the aristocratic underworld. 47 architects of human misery were set to congregate and drink to their victories, completely oblivious that their lavish party would descend into a fatal Last Supper. Samuel meticulously selected this specific botanical killer for its sheer, uncompromising viciousness. These seemingly innocent blooms flourished untamed across the entire perimeter of the sprawling estate, strikingly gorgeous yet profoundly deceptive. Their rosy petals offered a familiar aesthetic throughout the manicured courtyard, guaranteeing absolutely no one would ever question their sinister potential. This mirrored exactly how blind they were to the homicidal desires festering within the broken man who had waited on them hand and foot for almost 30 years. The lethal compound activated at a creeping pace, initially manifesting as mere disorientation and nausea that arrogant men would simply write off as heavy drinking and gluttony. Yet, as the unseen killer pooled inside their internal organs, things drastically shifted. Once the venomous chemicals deeply saturated their veins, it promised an inescapable, excruciating demise. A hypothesis he had already grimly verified using the estate's prized tracking hounds. He had observed with bone-chilling clinical apathy while the hounds ravenously devoured raw beef, secretly laced with the pulverized floral executioner. The horrifying outcome perfectly matched his darkest ambitions, seeing as the vicious beasts flatlined in a matter of mere hours. Their bodies completely shut down from massive heart attacks and suffocating lung collapses, proving undeniably that what slaughters a savage beast will equally butcher an evil tyrant. The morbid science was completely identical, simply operating on a far grander stage, while peering out the smeared glass revealed the initial ghostly streaks of morning. Soon enough, the sprawling compound would aggressively awaken. The chaotic scramble to finalize the evening meal would launch into full gear, dispatching terrified workers to sprint down the halls carrying mountains of fragile glass. Meanwhile, others would be ordered to buff the metalware and blindly arrange centerpieces harvested straight from the toxic thickets where his weapon grew in terrifying abundance. It was a darkly poetic twist of fate, Samuel mused, knowing these monsters would feast while entirely engulfed by the literal tools of their impending doom. Blindly ignorant that something so breathtaking could conceal a homicidal agenda, his thoughts were suddenly shattered by the heavy thud of boots echoing outside. This immediate threat forced him to swiftly stash the poisoned vessel inside a secret, hollowed-out alcove he had chiseled behind a massive flour barrel decades prior. He shifted with effortless, deeply rehearsed grace, moving purely as a seasoned survivor who had masterfully buried his murderous rage beneath an impenetrable veil of submissiveness. Dawn had barely broken when young Timothy stepped inside to commence his daily chores. The elderly cook was already manipulating the heavy dough for the upcoming banquets, his large, calloused palms rhythmically working the yeast with the exact chilling deliberation he had employed while crushing the deadly blossoms to fine dust. The boy murmured a quiet morning greeting to the old man. He addressed the senior cook with deep reverence, nervously whispering about the grand banquet their enslaver was hosting later that evening. 47 prominent figures were traveling from neighboring cities, marking the most massive assembly this sprawling estate had ever hosted. The seasoned chef offered a slow nod without ever lifting his gaze from the wooden preparation table. Yet a feral darkness flashed within his irises, a tempest brewing for decades, fueled by countless indignities, profound grief, and desperate nocturnal pleas just to live through the dawn. He softly agreed with the lad in a hushed, rumbling tone. His cadence remained as composed as his rhythmic movements, promising an extraordinary event that the privileged guests would carry with them to the grave. The warm, pliable yeast surrendered beneath his fingertips, brimming with a quiet capacity for metamorphosis, much like the lethal toxin concealed secretly behind the massive grain barrels. It merely lingered for the intense fire to alter its chemical essence, forging a completely altered substance out of the most basic elements. Yet, while the baked goods were meant to feed and provide sustenance, the toxic extract was destined to execute absolute vengeance masked beneath the veil of southern hospitality. Cold retribution would soon be plated flawlessly upon the most exquisite porcelain the vast estate owned, right as the young boy hurried around the room. The child ignited the hearths and meticulously arranged the massive cookhouse for the grueling hours ahead. The older man allowed his thoughts to wander back to the singular trauma that had shattered his restraint, recalling that horrific dawn 3 weeks prior when agonizing shrieks pierced the slave cabins. He remembered waking to the acrid stench of burning timber and witnessing infernal blazes clawing at the heavens like demonic appendages. Their cruel overseer had ruthlessly uncovered a secret belonging to the woman who had shared 25 years of marriage with the quiet cook. she had engaged in the illicit act of educating captive children, utilizing a sacred text hidden beneath the wooden floorboards of their cramped quarters. The penalty for such an act of rebellion was rigidly cemented in the twisted laws of the estate, mandating a horrific public immolation designed to crush any budding desires for freedom among the captive populace. Brutish guards had physically restrained the desperate husband, compelling him to witness his beloved spouse perish while she shrieked his identity in agony. The raging inferno had completely devoured her physical form, the wicked fires seemingly leaping with a sinister delight as they completed their murderous task. The tyrannical owner had remained stationed near the burning pyre, resembling a dark cleric presiding over an altar of absolute sadism. A deeply disturbing calm washed over the enslaver face, deeply gratified to showcase the lethal repercussions of questioning his supreme dominance. He loudly proclaimed to the terrified crowd that this massacre was a stark warning, his booming words slicing through the woman's final wails to declare that literacy belonged exclusively to the white elite. He callously warned the captive audience that horrific violence was the inevitable result of daring to dream beyond their chains. The tyrant preached that the blaze purged spiritual taint, while the grieving husband could do nothing but ball his hands in helpless fury as his lifelong partner faded away. However, the physical restraint of the guards was insurmountable, their leather lashes dangerously proximate, and their firearms utterly primed for execution. Paralyzed by absolute force, he stood agonizingly still as his own soul incinerated alongside his wife, transmuting his profound affection into a chilling weapon, significantly denser than stone. Right at that agonizing juncture, while the soaring blaze scraped the sky to ferry her spirit away, a dark resolve crystallized within him. The broken man swore an unbreakable oath that their brutal captor, along with every single wealthy spectator who had attended the gruesome slaughter, would suffer immensely. His vengeance would specifically target each elite property owner who had coldly signaled their endorsement while a human being was roasted alive. The heavy wooden entrance creaked a second time, revealing the sudden arrival of the senior butler. The typically stoic servant appeared visibly flustered, radiating the intense, frantic energy that forever shadowed grandiose gatherings upon the sprawling grounds. Acting as the chief steward, he carried the immense burden of guaranteeing that every single facet of the upcoming evening banquet remained utterly immaculate. He was tasked with actively inflating the cruel patriarch's social standing through an unparalleled display of culinary perfection and flawless servitude. The agitated butler called out to the baker while anxiously checking the gilded timepiece gifted to him as a token of submissive obedience. He frantically demanded a concluding assessment of the evening courses, stressing that 47 aristocrats anticipated a dining experience befitting their opulent status. This particular gathering was destined to dominate upper-class gossip spanning 3 distinct territories, demanding absolute culinary perfection. The poisoner calmly cleaned his powder-coated fingers against his canvas smock, offering the frantic butler a mask of pure apathy that perfectly concealed his internal inferno. He smoothly assured the steward that the preparations were proceeding flawlessly, promising that each specific recipe was receiving an intimately personalized touch. He vaguely promised that every minute element of the meal would perfectly reflect the precise treatment those wealthy visitors had earned. A dark, almost imperceptible undertone laced his chilling assurance regarding the guests, instantly causing the senior servant to freeze and intensely scrutinize the aging baker. Yet the stoic man offered zero visual clues, projecting only the identical subservient mastery that had defined his enslavement for almost 30 agonizing years. In fact, the quiet widower appeared dramatically more committed to his craft than on any typical morning. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp focus on the evening meal, prompting a nervous nod from the butler, who secretly sensed a profound lingering shift in the man aura following his beloved horrific murder. The evening's centerpiece was intended to be a slow-roasted suckling pig, paired with his renowned cornbread stuffing and golden fried chicken. Honey-glazed ham would follow. The menu demanded the sweet potato casseroles that the enslaver Whitmore fiercely craved, followed by his legendary peach cobbler and decadent bourbon bread pudding. Naturally, the kitchen had to yield enough portions to satisfy 47 deeply influential appetites. Samuel nodded silently, his mind already calculating the exact volume of oleander powder required to guarantee every guest a lethal dose. The sinister brilliance of his plot resided in its sheer simplicity, as he abandoned the risky idea of lacing just one dish that someone might decline. Instead, he intended to contaminate multiple courses, absolutely ensuring that every attendee ingested enough lethal compounds to secure their violent demise. The cornbread stuffing, sweet potato casseroles, and peach cobbler became quiet weapons. Even the bourbon bread pudding could conceal his deadly seasoning without ever raising a whisper of suspicion. Everything would be perfectly timed, Samuel assured Jeremiah. His tone held an eerie, melodic calm that forced the head servant to tilt his head, puzzled by the unfamiliar rhythm. People would speak of this haunting feast for generations. He promised Mr. Jeremiah that this specific dinner would change everything. The oblivious servant then walked away to finalize the remaining arrangements. Samuel unearthed a hidden ceramic bowl, staring down at the toxic oleander dust with the chilling satisfaction of a dark artist admiring his final masterpiece. The methodical preparation phase was almost completely finished. Soon, he would initiate the highly delicate procedure of weaving the lethal toxin into every single dish. He would measure each fatal dose with a chemist's precision and a priest's devotion, carrying out a sacred, bloody ritual. The sprawling estate was now wide awake, frantically bustling as enslaved workers prepared the lavish evening celebration. Through the glass, Samuel watched exhausted field hands returning from the brutal cotton rows. Their spines were bowed from severe exhaustion, and their fingers bled from plucking bowls beneath the overseer's predatory gaze. These suffering people were the ones destined to survive the blood-soaked reckoning tonight. They would wake tomorrow to a world fundamentally rewritten by his lethal actions. He orchestrated this nightmare for them, just as much as for Esther. He sought vengeance for Marcus, for Ruby, and for every shattered soul ground into dust beneath the relentless machinery of Whitmore's bloody prosperity. The psychological irony was exquisite. Tonight, 47 of Mississippi's wealthiest slaveholders would gather to arrogantly celebrate their utter dominance over human beings they deemed mere property. They would gladly toast their bloody profits. They would plot expansions, casually discussing the subjugation of entire human populations as if predicting the weather. Yet they would do so while swallowing their own grim demises, unknowingly ingesting cold justice disguised as warm hospitality. They would partake in a fatal communion that transformed them from masters into mere memories. Samuel began assembling the ingredients for the cornbread stuffing, his movements remaining intensely deliberate and chillingly ceremonial. Every component would be tainted with oleander powder, consecrated by the crystallized essence of his boiling rage. This lavish feast would ultimately become a mass funeral banquet. The celebration would become a dark wake, delivering a final defeat administered directly by the hands they believed they owned. As he worked, Samuel became acutely aware of an inexplicably strange phenomenon manifesting all around him. The suffocating, oppressive heat that typically rendered the kitchen unbearable had miraculously begun to cool and stabilize. It seemed his deadly, focused purpose was somehow enforcing order upon the chaotic, suffocating Mississippi humidity. The thick air grew unnervingly clear, and the heavy atmospheric weight lifted like a dark curse finally breaking. Even more significantly, he began sensing invisible, ghostly presences slowly gathering around him. These invisible watchers were drawn to the approaching moment of reckoning. He could not see them physically, yet he felt their chilling weight. They were the restless spirits of everyone who perished under Whitmore's brutal reign of terror. Esther was present, her once gentle soul finally at absolute peace now that pure vengeance was close at hand. Marcus stood firmly beside her, shedding the image of a frightened, chained boy to become a hardened young man, burning with an intense, righteous fury. Ruby danced between them, her ethereal laughter ringing like silver bells. Her profound joy over the impending justice was completely infectious, even in its supernatural form. Samuel slowly realized that they were all silently gathering. Every enslaved person who had died on this cursed plantation was present, standing as fractured souls broken by the merciless wheel of Whitmore's calculated cruelty. Every lingering spirit had crossed into the next world, carrying the agonizing burden of unaddressed injustices, unpunished atrocities, and entirely unacknowledged suffering. They arrived to witness the ultimate balancing of bloody accounts, desperate to watch their murderer finally face severe earthly consequences for his sins. The kitchen filled with their phantom whispers, forming a chilling chorus of dark encouragement that only Samuel could detect. "Cook our agony into that food," they murmured in voices resembling wind blowing through Spanish moss. "Season the feast with our collective tears. Force them to taste the poison they made us swallow. Prove that some blood debts are entirely unforgivable, and some dark sins can never be forgotten." A chilling certainty steadied his fingers as the cook commenced the dark, sacred ritual of lacing the extravagant banquet with venom. Every dash of crushed oleander represented a dark answered prayer, and every tainted vessel brought him closer to a terrifying universal equilibrium. He ceased being just an enslaved chef catering to his captor's jubilee, morphing instead into an agent of ultimate vengeance, an unstoppable elemental force resembling raging tempests and torrential deluges. This dark reckoning felt as inevitable as the surging waters rising to violently wash away the deep, festering transgressions, polluting the sprawling delta. The traditional baked maize dressing became the initial target of his deeply personal, lethal meticulousness. It was a culinary masterpiece he had honed through countless grueling seasons of forced labor. But as he slipped the toxic dust deep into the batter, a profound, icy release shuddered through his soul. It felt exactly like the agonizing spiritual shackles strangling him for 28 harrowing years were suddenly shattering into dust. Every tiny speck of venom dissolved flawlessly deep within the rich, savory batter, leaving the weapon utterly undetectable to an arrogant eye, yet devastatingly lethal in its pure, focused malice. The baked yam medleys immediately followed in his grim assembly line of retribution. Their vibrant amber crusts provided the ultimate camouflage for the ghostly dust engineered to turn their arrogant jubilee into an apocalyptic nightmare. He operated with the chilling, calculating brilliance of an assassin, measuring precise toxins against the predicted appetites of the elite guests, fully aware that exactly 47 lavish portions were scheduled to leave his kitchen this evening. This meant 47 calculated doses of brutal retribution would be served beneath the warm, deceitful veil of traditional regional charm. Ghostly ancestors crowded his workspace as he toiled, their ethereal silhouettes solidifying with every ticking minute, until he practically witnessed their shimmering, semi-transparent bodies hovering through the sweltering culinary haze like desert illusions. Yet their ghostly whispers sliced through the air with terrifying, crystal-clear desperation. "Ensure they suffer," the Phantom of Esther hissed, delivering commands that felt seductively melodic yet violently agonizing, demanding he force them to realize his people breathed as human beings rather than mere chattel. She demanded he prove to their tormentors that their existence held immense worth, and that their brutal murders absolutely required a bloody settlement. He administered the deadly augmentation to the rich whiskey-soaked dessert with the profound, chilling reverence of an apocalyptic priest giving final rites. He blended the toxic dust into the heavy cream foundation using deliberate motions that elevated his task far beyond simple culinary preparation. The chef orchestrated a masterful symphony of revenge, designed to reach its horrifying crescendo inside the oppressor's lavish feasting hall, where every scrape of his timber ladle sparked a microscopic, violent rebellion. Every circular motion propelled his brutalized community closer to absolute freedom from the arrogant tyrants who foolishly believed they were invincible. The grim orchestrations reached their conclusion by midday, as he secretly anointed every single item on the extravagant evening roster with his uniquely devastating spice. He successfully weaponized every solitary course, using the powdered, tangible manifestation of countless years of unyielding agony. The spread appeared brilliantly harmless, perfectly mimicking the lavish autumnal banquet demanded by the notoriously wealthy aristocracy of the Deep South. The savory maize dressing radiated a warm, buttery glow from within its pristine porcelain bowls. The vibrant yam bake simmered with a deceptive, hearty warmth, while the decadent pastries offered a facade of unimaginable culinary delight. But the quiet chef harbored a deeply terrifying secret. He fully comprehended the monstrous tragedy he had forged inside the suffocating, fiery belly of that prison kitchen, understanding precisely what dark, irreversible mechanisms his meticulous sabotage had triggered. Later this evening, as the arrogant captors assembled to toast their bloody fortunes, they would unknowingly swallow their own agonizing demise. Pure vengeance would be elegantly delivered upon their most polished sterling flatware, and absolute devastation would sit beautifully displayed across their imported, irreplaceable ceramics. Mortality itself arrived camouflaged as the lavish southern grace that originally funded their empires through the shattered spines of captive innocence. The daylight hours bled away in a tense blur of frantic culinary finishing touches and a creeping, electrifying dread. Fellow captive workers darted frantically across the cooking space, shuttling heavy platters toward the heating grates while organizing the grand, ornamental centerpieces for the massive banquet. Yet he drifted through the chaotic frenzy, possessing the chilling calmness of an assassin whose ultimate masterpiece was mere moments from its bloody execution. His dark objective had been forged through traumatic infernos and distilled by profound grief. So when dusk settled and the initial elite attendees rolled onto the grounds in their polished coaches, he waited. The quiet cook anchored himself in the center of the culinary inferno, completely prepared to manage the distribution of lethal vengeance, masked as a joyous jubilee. Gazing past the glass panes, he observed the wealthy tyrants congregating across the sprawling mansion porch, their complexions reddened by sheer greed and heavy liquor. Their arrogant tones boomed through the twilight, exchanging self-serving praises alongside vile, mocking humor directed at the very people they kept chained. In mere minutes, those booming, arrogant chuckles would violently morph into desperate, blood-curdling shrieks. Furthermore, the patriarch's celebrated autumnal banquet was destined to become a horrifying massacre nobody could have possibly predicted, especially as ghostly entities now violently twirled just outside his peripheral sight. The spectral silhouettes solidified rapidly as the clock ticked closer to doom, their ethereal excitement swelling toward a horrifying climax, guaranteed to permanently shatter the oppressive estate's foundations. The most catastrophic, bloody judgment the deep southern state had ever witnessed stood merely seconds from detonating. The resolute chef remained perfectly still, prepared to execute divine punishment through stunning culinary displays and utterly murderous resolve. A fierce, fiery glow from the imported glass fixtures illuminated the massive feasting hall as 47 of the territory's most ruthless agricultural barons settled around the gigantic timber table. Hovering silently by the culinary entryway, the cook observed the men sinking into their velvet seats, exactly like scavenging vultures swarming a fresh, bloody carcass. Heavy whiskey and unchecked avarice had already stained their aristocratic features, a deep, feverish crimson. Their booming voices echoed with mutual admiration for yet another incredibly lucrative harvest, counting a fortune entirely extracted through the shattered spines of captive innocence. At the head of the grand dining table, Jonathan Whitmore presided over the room with the chilling authority of an untouchable monarch. He wore a flawless, dark, tailored suit, completely unbothered by the suffocating dampness of the sweltering southern evening. Positioned directly to his right was Colonel Marcus Beauregard of the Natchez Territory, an individual whose staggering brutality horrified even the most hardened men. Terrifying rumors constantly drifted through the darkened cabins regarding Beauregard and his horrific late-night patrols across the human cultivation camps. He personally chose female captives to force into motherhood to multiply his workforce, while Judge Harrison Caldwell relaxed casually to the left. The courtroom belonging to this judge operated as a horrific stage for absolute corruption and systemic bias. Captive men and women faced ruthless trials and immediate hangings for meaningless offenses like taking a single crumb of bread or simply making eye contact. Caldwell ran a horrific compound entirely dedicated to crushing the spirits of defiant workers purchased from frustrated masters. Terrified whispers echoed across 3 distinct territories regarding his calculated mental abuse, describing sadistic practices that kept victims breathing but entirely hollowed out their souls. Seated further down the mahogany expanse was Dr. Thaddeus Morton, a physician who weaponized his healing arts to force agonizing labor from severely wounded individuals. This twisted physician ultimately mastered several horrifying surgical procedures. These specialized medical routines healed savage lash wounds just enough, permitting brutal guards to mercilessly flog the laborers without ever losing their financial investment. His personal infirmary doubled as a macabre laboratory where captive women endured horrific scientific trials meant to unnaturally boost their reproductive output. This gathering was definitely not a simple group of rich gentlemen toasting to a bountiful agricultural season. They operated as the supreme designers of widespread agony, methodically constructing a legal framework that literally transformed breathing humans into disposable assets. As absolute masters of sadism, they dedicated countless years to draining every ounce of energy from their captives, while strictly enforcing enough terror to crush uprisings. This particular night was distinctly different. The syndicate convened to strategize, spreading their horrific network of chains into uncharted frontiers, while actively debating fresh tactics for population control. They intended to toast their absolute dominance over countless thousands of doomed lives. Yet Samuel sensed unseen phantoms crowding his shoulders. The spectral entities surrounding him became increasingly restless and furious whenever sickening chuckles echoed from the opulent banquet hall. The lingering soul of Esther materialized right beside him, appearing so remarkably vivid that he clearly recognized the beautiful features he had cherished for 25 years. Pure, justified rage ignited in her spectral gaze, while she monitored the very monsters responsible for her murder, casually smoking right before their lethal banquet. She softly urged Samuel to gaze upon the despicable men in the adjacent room. Her ghostly tone maintained that same gorgeous melodic rhythm that previously warmed their tiny shack through comforting nighttime melodies. She pointed out their sickening grins as they casually arranged to purchase more innocent lives, noting their cruel amusement over reproductive calendars and torture methods. These arrogant tyrants genuinely believed they possessed divine authority and absolutely untouchable power. Dozens of other restless phantoms solemnly bobbed their heads in dark solidarity, including elderly Moses, who perished from severe dehydration after a guard refused him a drink, alongside youthful Sarah from the main estate. That poor girl suffered a fatal, savage beating simply because she accidentally dropped an expensive ceramic dish that her owners valued higher than human existence. Then there was tiny Benjamin, an innocent child measuring barely 8 years of age. The boy was ruthlessly torn away from his grieving mother, ultimately passing away from profound emotional devastation before his carriage arrived at the secondary property. Every single victim congregated together in the shadows, representing all the innocent people destroyed by the supreme cruelty of these 47 overlords. These ghostly silhouettes packed the cooking area like a tragic assembly of the betrayed, lifting their quiet murmurs in eager preparation for the devastating vengeance. A massive surge of their combined desperate energy rushed powerfully through Samuel. Their centuries of bottled-up longing for violent payback injected pure strength into his weary muscles and anchored his trembling fingers, signaling that the ultimate climax was truly here. The head butler Jeremiah suddenly manifested at the entry frame, his features radiating an anxious thrill as he readied himself to manage a legendary gastronomic masterpiece. A quiet procession of domestic workers lined up immediately behind him, perfectly positioned to transport the lavish banquet directly into the opulent gathering space. They balanced heavy silver platters entirely saturated with a lethal dose of toxic plant extract, capable of instantly wiping out an entire military battalion. Jeremiah anxiously addressed the cook while checking his golden timepiece with shaking hands, declaring that their host demanded the initial appetizer delivery immediately. The butler stressed that the presentation required absolute perfection, reminding everyone that these powerful regional elites accepted absolutely zero flaws in their dining experience. The quiet chef simply lowered his head in agreement, fully aware that a flawless execution was absolutely guaranteed through a much darker medium. He crafted every single plate with unnerving, deadly precision, lacing the exquisite ingredients with the pure, concentrated venom born from generations of unspeakable agony. The rich baked maize dressing radiated a deceptive warm hue from within its polished metallic containers. Hearty root vegetable bakes simmered with a false aura of rustic purity, while the surrounding platters visually guaranteed an absolutely unforgettable culinary euphoria. Yet the stoic cook remained the sole keeper of the catastrophic horror silently woven into the fabric of the mouth-watering spread. He integrated the pulverized toxic floral dust across the entire menu, using cold, calculating, and ruthless scientific accuracy. He calibrated the exact dosage to ensure every attendee ingested a lethal amount before midnight. Arsenic and strychnine always struck with rapid, undeniable violence, but this was different. Oleander crept through veins at a glacial pace. The initial distress easily mimicked the aftermath of excessive meat and heavy liquor. The attack would commence as a gentle ache. These arrogant lords would wave away the creeping nausea as a mere consequence of their own unchecked gluttony. Yet, the silent venom was already saturating their blood. The lethal botanical compounds would slowly hijack their beating hearts. The agony would accelerate wildly. Severe sickness would rapidly surrender to terrifying chest palpitations, suffocating gasps, and ultimate cardiovascular failure. The Reaper would arrive within mere hours. Their demise was destined to be excruciating and totally unavoidable. "Serve the bread dressing first," he commanded the staff. His tone remained perfectly composed, masking the inferno of vengeance roaring within his soul. "Ensure every man receives a massive portion. The estate lord takes immense pride in this specific creation. I spent 28 long years perfecting this masterpiece." A dark, hollow resonance shadowed his chilling statement about 28 years of relentless practice. The chilling delivery prompted the other houseworkers to trade nervous stares. Yet, not one could articulate why the elder cook felt so dangerous. They remained utterly blind to the profound psychological metamorphosis that had just crystallized inside that suffocating, sweltering southern kitchen. The enslaved staff marched out, carrying absolute devastation. The architect of this massacre hid silently behind the wall. He peered through the narrow service hatch to witness the unfolding tragedy. He studied the scene with the clinical apathy of a researcher monitoring a lethal trial as the venomous banquets landed. The aristocrats leaned over their porcelain plates. They eagerly swallowed the instrument of their impending doom with genuine delight. The plantation patriarch eagerly took the inaugural bite of tainted breading. He shoveled a massive portion past his lips. He nodded smugly as the comforting taste washed over him. "Absolutely superb work," he shouted toward the back room. The oppressor used the dismissive inflection reserved for an obedient hound. 28 long years of submissive loyalty," he declared. "You continuously astound me with your kitchen mastery." Beside him, a decorated military officer aggressively scooped a massive heap onto his plate. A wicked smile twisted his face. He chewed blindly, utterly convinced he was savoring exceptional regional heritage fare. "You possess the absolute greatest cooking crew around," the officer proclaimed. Dark whiskey already slurred the edges of his arrogant declaration. "This magnificent dish easily shames my own home dining. I paid triple the price for my kitchen servant compared to your cheap investment." A local magistrate enthusiastically piled baked yams onto his plate. The vibrant mash brilliantly camouflaged its fatal additive beneath a rich crust of melted dairy and dark molasses. "The true magic lies in the spice blend," the judge announced. He spoke with the blind confidence of a dictator lecturing on entirely misunderstood subjects. They possess a primal intuition for taste that polite society simply lacks. It runs in their bloodlines, much like the predatory senses of sporting hounds we command but deeply misunderstand. The distinguished physician eagerly reached for a second massive serving. His scientific background made him highly observant. He tragically mistook the lethal chemical complexity for sheer culinary brilliance. "The consistency is utterly flawless," the physician noted while slicing with anatomical exactness. "It masterfully avoids being overly parched or soggy. Your aging cook struck a masterful harmony. The dish undeniably proves decades of relentless discipline and profound focus." The shadowy architect watched them devour their demise. A chilling fulfillment washed over his soul, reaching depths far beyond simple vengeance. This grand execution was never solely about butchering the monsters who dismantled his bloodline. Eradicating them was merely a beautiful byproduct. Tonight was an act of divine equalization. He was forcefully correcting a universe deeply fractured by the monstrous, barbaric enterprise of human bondage. These 47 overlords dedicated their existences to viewing living souls as inventory. They constructed massive empires directly upon bloody foundations of misery and the calculated erasure of human dignity. The abusers genuinely believed their sadistic actions were completely righteous. They viewed their bleeding captives as biologically inferior animals. They falsely preached that the sacred devotion binding captive families was hollow. They arrogantly assumed love only ran deep within the veins of the privileged oppressors. Armed with this lie, they viciously ripped crying infants from mothers and forcibly divided devoted spouses. They tore apart lineages, bartering human flesh with the exact same cold apathy used when trading mere livestock or rusted farm implements. But tonight, they were finally swallowing the fatal harvest of his meticulous labor. These monsters would finally realize their captives held identical reservoirs of affection, profound emotional depths, and the unyielding tribal loyalty they violently hoarded for themselves. They would realize the sacred emotional ties they callously butchered carried the exact same unshakable permanence as their own elite bloodlines. Fracturing those eternal connections carried a catastrophic price tag, stretching infinitely beyond their shallow comprehension. Unseen phantoms pulsed with aggression. Their silhouettes hardened into dense shadows as the botanical venom ruthlessly executed its dark objective. Samuel watched the transparent specters drift through the candlelit dining hall, flickering like desert heat, yet their haunting reality was undeniable. These phantoms drifted past the seated overlords like spectral servants. Ghostly fingers brushed against the tyrants who had demanded their execution, while murmured voices swelled into a dark symphony of waiting. The spirit of Esther murmured from the void that the reckoning was beginning, her spectral awe filling his chest with a dark, triumphant pride. She asked if he sensed the scales tipping as his silent labor summoned divine retribution to carve truth into this mansion of deceit. He absolutely felt the shift, a quiet yet undeniable severing of the spiritual fabric cloaking the sprawling estate. The heavy atmosphere pulsed with cold potential, carrying the heavy vow of a revolution that had been violently suppressed for far too long. This toxic banquet was evolving into something far greater than simple vengeance. It transformed into an engine of universal judgment, funneling the deep yearning for liberation among his captive people into one lethal moment. He watched from the shadows. He observed the overlords devouring their food with terrifying greed. The men progressed to the primary courses, eagerly slicing into thick slabs of roasted meat secretly laced with lethal ground flora. They feasted on battered poultry rubbed with fatal spices, alongside greens masking absolute creeping devastation. Every mouthful deposited another layer of concentrated toxin, driving their biology rapidly toward an irreversible collapse. As expected, the dining room chatter pivoted to cold commerce, since these predators never congregated merely to celebrate wealth. They met to strategize the relentless growth of their human trafficking empire. They colluded to infect virgin territories with subjugation, trading brutal new methods for dominating their captive human inventory. A local magistrate declared that the border conflicts demanded their urgent intervention. His tone dripped with the arrogance of a judge who routinely ruined lives, warning against letting liberators claim any new ground. Such a breach would severely jeopardize the westward spread of their horrific forced labor system. A military officer offered a dark nod, stalling his intake of the fatal pork to point his silver utensil defensively. He insisted they sharpen their ruthless political alliances immediately. The northern factions were growing dangerously defiant, using subversive rhetoric that actively swayed the masses against their cruel traditions. This resistance infected boundary zones that typically endorsed their cause. The physician scooped extra root vegetables, blindly feeding another lethal dose into his ruined organs, while arguing that objective data validated their supremacy. He spoke with the blind arrogance of a man using academic credentials to mask deep hatred. He claimed anatomical research proved definitively that their captives were biologically designed for heavy toil. He reasoned that European descendants were built for intellectual dominance, concluding they were tyrannizing nobody. They were merely structuring civilization alongside strict biological destiny. The estate owner hoisted his goblet, the glass trapping the flickering flames like burning blood, offering a salute to cultural conquest. His resonant voice echoed through the shadowy hall with sickening solemnity, praising the rigid hierarchy of their world. He credited the heavens for their wealth, toasting the enduring torture machine that crowned them as the richest elites on earth. Acid clawed his throat while he endured their detached debates over trafficking and their clinical excuses for reducing breathing souls to assets. They even weaponized theology, claiming a higher power explicitly blessed their empire of torment. These monsters openly categorized captive bloodlines as agricultural livestock. Infants were projected as upcoming commodities, while aging captives were viewed as damaged inventory, requiring swift elimination. Each syllable slashed at his humanity, cementing the absolute necessity of the dark execution he had so meticulously set in motion. Yet beneath that searing fury, a deeply chilling wave of psychological calm washed completely through his mind. His lethal blueprint was unfolding with absolute perfection. The silent venom traveled deeply through their veins, pooling in their blood to unleash the bloody retribution the law forever denied. Their comfortable debates on subjugation would abruptly shatter against undeniable physical agony, a biological mirror of the profound rot festering inside. The earliest indicators would arrive quietly, manifesting as mild sickness. A wave of vertigo would easily be blamed on heavy meals, until the deadly floral extracts firmly took hold internally. The unseen chemical agents would finally sabotage their beating chests. The horrific agony would quickly surpass any discomfort they could wave away. Samuel mapped out this exact timeline, merging his dark experiments on the hounds with the deep medical intuition he earned, patching up broken laborers for years. The initial wave of catastrophic physical failure was scheduled to strike in less than 60 minutes. The strike would hit right as the elite guests retreated into their comfortable haze of aged liquor and imported tobacco. From there, the decline would be terrifyingly fast, hitting them with the unstoppable force of a bursting levee, a brutal reckoning finally crashing down upon their lavish estate. Peering through the narrow kitchen window, he observed the arrogant men devouring their sweets with the exact same ravenous greed they had displayed all evening. The baked fruit vanished from their plates in a flash, its sugary crust perfectly masking the lethal retribution baked right into the dough. The liquor-soaked pastry earned rave reviews around the table, prompting multiple men to demand extra portions of what they blindly mistook for premier culinary grace. The guests marveled that the brilliant cook managed to top his own achievements with every passing season. The wealthy physician offered his praise while releasing a deeply contented breath, remarking that the pastry possessed a hauntingly exquisite flavor he had never encountered before. "You will never experience another meal in your miserable lives," the chef silently promised, while soaking in the cold thrill of his impending triumph. "This very evening marks the absolute end of your endless hunger for human suffering and unbridled greed." Ethereal shadows began to sway in the dim corners of the banquet hall, swirling in a silent, ecstatic frenzy as they sensed their long-overdue vindication. He easily caught the faint, melodic hum of their freedom chants, absorbing the overwhelming surge of spiritual triumph filling the stifling room. These unseen witnesses were gathering to observe the brutal collapse of the monsters who had ruthlessly shredded their existences and blown their loved ones apart like storm wreckage. The phantom of a deceased elder slapped his transparent palms together, keeping perfect time with a distant, mournful hymn drifting over from the slave cabins. For the first time in memory, the old man stood tall and proud, entirely free from the crushing, agonizing burden of lifelong servitude. A murdered girl giggled with absolute, untainted joy, her soul completely unshackled from the relentless terror that had defined her tragic end. A small boy pranced happily among the floating elders, reclaiming his stolen innocence as absolute karmic symmetry approached, singing ominous hymns that rustled like dead vines in a breeze. Retribution was finally arriving, plated as a sugary, lethal masterpiece on imported porcelain dishes. These wealthy tyrants are about to discover the sheer terror of absolute helplessness, realizing too late that their inevitable demise was orchestrated by the very property they claimed to possess. Meanwhile, the banquet banter sank into horrifying depths of sociopathic indifference as the aristocrats gleefully plotted to spread their human trafficking empire further west. They openly calculated the worth of breathing souls as mere cogs in their agricultural machinery. Infants were casually debated as raw financial investments, while entire bloodlines were reduced to livestock meant to be bred for peak profit, proving the utter rot consuming their black hearts. Each arrogant syllable they uttered only cemented the necessity of the fatal venom currently pumping through their greedy veins. The quiet assassin glanced at the wall dial, confirming that almost 60 minutes had elapsed since the poisoned appetizers first hit the table. Assuming his botanical math held true, the highly toxic plant extract was seconds away from triggering a horrific internal collapse. The invisible chemical compounds were silently building up inside their vital organs, ready to violently hijack their cardiovascular functions. He braced himself to oversee the rapid, agonizing doom these monsters had purchased with generations of blood and unrelenting savagery. Stepping back to the wooden grate, he found the perfect vantage point to study every twitch and grimace crossing their flushed faces. He lingered in the shadows for that initial gasp of pain, knowing it would spark the most devastating massacre this southern state had ever witnessed. The aggrieved servant planned to burn every agonizing second of their demise into his memory forever. He needed to see this heavily deferred retribution finally collect its bloody toll from arrogant elites who genuinely believed their money made them invincible. Unseen phantoms crowded tightly against his shoulders in the sweltering heat of the kitchen. Their spectral excitement surged toward a violent climax that would rewrite history, lifting into a haunting chorus of freedom audible only to his ears as the final countdown began. In mere moments, those arrogant chuckles would morph into choking shrieks, twisting the grand autumn banquet into a macabre slaughterhouse no aristocrat could have ever anticipated. The lethal concoction tore through their nervous systems like the literal wrath of a vengeful god crashing down upon the wicked. It felt as though an invisible, omnipotent hand had finally descended to shatter a societal scale hopelessly tilted toward darkness for over a century. The initial crack in their facade materialized at the exact second the brilliant cook had projected, violently interrupting a prominent military officer right in the middle of a boast. The man dragged a heavy palm up to his sternum, instinctively clawing at a sudden, suffocating pressure that had wrapped around his heart like a striking viper. His arrogant complexion, previously glowing with the warm hue of premium whiskey and immense ego, suddenly underwent a horrifying transformation. A sickening, ashen pallor washed over his skin, looking deeply grotesque and morbid beneath the dancing glow of the table flames. The officer mumbled a confused complaint about a bizarre ache, tearing at his silk necktie with subtly vibrating fingers while blindly blaming the decadent feast. The dying man convinced himself it was merely indigestion from such a luxurious meal, while the cook analyzed the scene from the window with the icy, calculated gaze of an apex predator watching a trap spring shut. He felt the supernatural entities crowding his spine, their shared eagerness boiling over into the catastrophic finale they had spent generations praying to witness. The beautiful, toxic flower was finally executing its gruesome and deeply deserved masterpiece. The lethal plant toxins quietly saturated the bloodstream of the colonel, driving him toward inevitable cardiac arrest. Yet this military veteran was hardly the sole victim experiencing these agonizing biological changes. A distinct, ashen pallor washed over the face of the physician. Thanks to years of clinical study, he sensed the physiological devastation unfolding within his own tissues long before his peers realized their peril. His heartbeat fluttered wildly, making every single inhalation terribly difficult. He foolishly blamed this severe distress on gluttony rather than a calculated poisoning. Nobody fathomed that a feast of traditional Southern charm was actually a meticulously plated execution. The prominent magistrate grasped his crystal goblet, his fingers betraying a subtle but undeniable neurological tremor. The once booming baritone of the lawman dissolved into a ragged rasp, signaling acute pulmonary failure. He praised the host for an extraordinary dinner. Pushing the words past his failing lungs required immense physical exertion as he complimented the servant for delivering such an unforgettable culinary experience. The master of the estate was also succumbing to the toxic flora. Yet, his biological reaction to the botanical weapon took a distinctly different path than that of his dying associates. While the visiting guests suffered violent arrhythmias and severe respiratory failure, the host battled violent surges of gastric revolt, desperately attempting to maintain his polished veneer of high society charm. A cold sweat completely drenched his forehead, entirely defying the crisp, cooling autumn breeze. His legendary aura of absolute authority crumbled as a predatory agony began to devour his digestive tract from the inside out. He proposed relocating to the parlor for a round of fine tobacco and expensive spirits. He pushed away from the table with calculated deliberation, terrified of revealing his rapidly deteriorating motor skills. A breath of fresh wind might theoretically cure their collective feverish delusions. The elite guests offered quiet nods of consensus, completely oblivious to the bitter irony. Multiple men fought to pull themselves upright, masking the paralytic lethargy that had already woven itself deeply into their nervous systems. The servant observed the doomed aristocrats abandoning the grand banquet hall. Their arrogant strides had decayed into the clumsy, staggering footsteps of individuals suffering from a catastrophic internal collapse they could not fathom. Yet this preliminary agony merely scratched the surface. The botanical extract operated in brutal, systematic chapters, escalating in pure biological terror. Their current torment functioned solely as the terrifying prelude to a masterfully orchestrated physiological breakdown designed to peak by morning. The invisible organic compounds were busy multiplying within their vascular highways. The chemical invasion dismantled their cardiovascular functions, triggering a spectacular domino effect of organ failure. Vengeful apparitions trailed the wealthy men into the parlor, their ethereal shapes hardening into undeniable reality as the poison took hold. The servant possessed perfect visual clarity of the dead. They ceased being mere optical illusions dancing within the heat. These were now entirely corporeal entities, gliding past the condemned aristocrats as pure avatars of long-awaited retribution. A murdered wife matched pace with the master of the house, her formerly sweet visage now radiating absolute malice. Her spectral fingers brushed against the dictator who had orchestrated her execution, whispering a dark greeting. Her tone retained that hauntingly beautiful cadence that formerly brought boundless joy to their humble, stolen moments. She taunted him about the suffocating pressure crushing his ribs and the acidic inferno igniting his stomach, branding it the bitter flavor of absolute consequence. This singular moment of reckoning was the product of endless decades of silent, agonizing patience. Meanwhile, the remaining apparitions cornered their specific murderers. Every ghost cornered the exact tyrant responsible for ending their existence or shattering their bloodline. An elderly victim loomed silently behind the military officer, casting a shadowy grasp upon the overseer who had brutally worked him into an early grave. The executed girl stood right beside the corrupt magistrate. Her soul radiated pure, unadulterated vengeance, while glaring down at the corrupt official who had mandated her execution over a single shattered piece of porcelain. A spectral boy skipped circles around the physician, his youthful purity brilliantly mutating into a terrifying weapon of karmic balance. Inside the lavish parlor, the doomed elite desperately faked a mood of high society camaraderie, ignoring the profound biological terror gripping every single one of them. Trembling fingers sparked expensive tobacco. Premium liquor splashed into crystal tumblers, followed by violently vibrating attempts to raise a glass in celebration. The previously arrogant banter completely dissolved into a grim silence. Every chuckle rang out with a terrifying emptiness, while sheer panic crept into their gazes upon realizing a fatal catastrophe was unfolding internally. One man cursed his supposed stomach troubles. The military veteran grumbled bitterly, clutching his sternum as his cardiovascular engine stuttered wildly out of its natural, healthy cadence. He described the excruciating internal pressure as severe blunt force trauma. The brilliant clinical mind of the physician finally shattered his own delusional theories regarding culinary gluttony and excessive alcohol consumption. He monitored his wrist with absolute, undeniable, and escalating terror. The chaotic thumping underneath his skin pointed toward a catastrophic cardiac event rather than a mere stomach ache. Each gasp for oxygen became horrifyingly difficult. Drawing a single breath demanded intense physical concentration as the botanical compounds violently shut down his entire pulmonary network. He addressed the room, his vocal cords paralyzed by an unadulterated dread. It seems highly probable that a lethal contaminant has infiltrated our meals. These severe biological reactions indicate a deliberate toxic exposure, far beyond an ordinary stomach illness. That chilling assessment echoed through the opulent parlor with the heavy finality of a sinking boulder. An undercurrent of sheer terror immediately infected every aristocratic soul in attendance. The host visibly drained of color, frantically mentally retracing every decadent course served that tragic evening. He desperately hunted for the hidden catalyst that had suddenly decimated his hand-picked elite circle. Yet the architect of their doom stood silently, certain his secret remained entirely undiscovered. That lethal botanical extract was meticulously laced into the very fabric of the banquet. The deadly agent was seamlessly blended across multiple platters, obliterating any singular culinary trail. Above all, their blinding prejudice prevented them from ever imagining a supposedly subservient laborer had methodically weaponized their luxurious banquet. A strike of this magnitude was utterly unimaginable to them. Existing light years beyond the perceived capabilities of human beings, they reduced to mere chattel. The magistrate fought to rise. He likely aimed to demand immediate medical intervention. Instead, his knees completely surrendered as a catastrophic cardiovascular collapse echoed the skyrocketing lethal compounds surging through his veins. The man crumpled into the upholstery, releasing a pathetic wheeze reminiscent of a ruptured lung. His complexion rapidly deteriorated into the unmistakable ashen shadow that signaled the final, brutal phase of botanical assassination. "This is a nightmare," he choked out, his historically dominant tone shrinking into an utterly pathetic croak. "We are in grave danger. My lungs are entirely failing me." Pure hysteria rapidly ignited across the room, mirroring an inferno devouring a parched landscape. The chaos instantly incinerated the fragile facade of high society these monsters wore to conceal their inherent savage cruelty. The desperate host stumbled frantically in the direction of the service cord. However, motor function abandoned him entirely as the neurotoxin severely severed the crucial link between his brain and his limbs. Uncontrollable tremors hijacked his reaching fingers, while a sickening perspiration drenched his features, in total defiance of the chilly parlor breeze. Yet, an astonishing delusion persisted during this profound biological betrayal. The microscopic floral weapon was launching a catastrophic siege upon their failing internal systems. These tyrannical overlords remained utterly incapable of entertaining the reality that a subjugated laborer had masterminded their impending demise. Their tyrannical ideology remained completely inflexible. The grotesque illusion of a biological caste system blinded them from acknowledging that a supposedly inferior piece of property held the intellectual brilliance and absolute ruthlessness to orchestrate their eradication. The Avenger silently glided toward the grand parlor entrance. The shadows of this scullery could no longer contain his immense thirst to personally supervise the agonizing conclusion of their wretched lives. Phantoms of the fallen marched beside him, their previously ethereal silhouettes crystallizing into undeniable, terrifying reality. A righteous fury illuminated those spectral visages as they witnessed their tormentors finally swallowing a lethal dose of overdue retribution. The unfolding massacre exceeded even his most magnificent, blood-soaked fantasies of ultimate payback. 47 elite titans of the Deep South were currently twisting on the floorboards, succumbing to violent botanical executions. Violent spasms hijacked their limbs, while failing cardiac muscles desperately fought a losing battle against the overwhelming venom flooding their veins. Several victims desperately gripped their rib cages, while erratic, catastrophic heartbeats electrocuted their nervous systems with unparalleled agony. Nearby, affluent guests violently expelled crimson fluid as their ravaged stomachs viciously rejected the disguised venom they had gluttonously devoured. An esteemed battlefield commander ranked among the most severely degraded casualties, his proud martial posture disintegrating as he shriveled into a pathetic knot atop the imported rug. Oxygen evaded him entirely, forcing out shallow, panicked wheezes as his suffocating lungs commenced an irreversible collapse. This monster had spent a lifetime treating innocent souls as mere agricultural commodities to be bred. He was a demon who callously forced reproduction upon terrified women solely to multiply his financial assets. Now, the tyrant was transformed into a sobbing beast, pleading for salvation from a universe that was aggressively collecting an unspeakable karmic debt. A lifetime of clinical expertise morphed into pure psychological torture for the attending physician, as he distinctly comprehended the biological massacre decimating his aristocratic peers. Erratic pulses, suffocating airways, and the rapid, terrifying numbness creeping through their spinal cords confirmed his darkest fears. These catastrophic symptoms, unequivocally, mapped out a calculated toxic invasion, guaranteed to terminate their lives before midnight. Any futile impulse to render emergency aid was violently blocked by his own deteriorating cognition, as the botanical assassin severely damaged his neurological pathways. A dense fog smothered his intellect, entirely deleting his capacity for rational deduction. He identified the fatal floral compound with a suffocating croak, whispering clinical diagnoses, while thick crimson fluid actively drowned his vocal cords. An unknown adversary has successfully slaughtered our entire inner circle. The magistrate processed this chilling medical verdict through an overwhelming haze of absolute agony and paralyzing dread. A horrifying clarity finally pierced his gaze, bringing the terrifying realization that this mass execution was a highly calculated strike. Yet, while his analytical intellect comprehended the staggering scale of this massacre, his deep-seated prejudice fundamentally blocked the truth. He absolutely refused to accept that a chained laborer could harbor the scientific genius and ruthless audacity required to execute such a flawless annihilation. "Northern radicals," he rasped, his dying breath escaping in a nearly silent, pathetic hiss. Investigators claimed Northern operatives simply poisoned the daily meals. A perfectly cruel paradox unfolded as these men perished by toxic doses delivered by the very individual they viewed as a mere possession. These architects of human captivity were entirely blind to the profound intellect and calculated autonomy of those they subjugated. It was easier to invent complex fictions about external troublemakers than admit their captives harbored the exact same instinct for meticulous premeditation and vengeance they possessed. The patriarch eventually grasped the signaling cord with sheer panic. His physical control had failed so profoundly that the simple exertion almost toppled him. Heavy brass chimes reverberated sharply across the estate. Workers rushed inward to discover their captors experiencing the brutal climax of a retribution meticulously crafted over decades. The quiet chef understood clearly that zero medical interventions could reverse this fate. The floral toxins had already migrated deep into their systems, saturating vital organs. It completely dismantled their ability to pump and breathe. The domestic staff answering that frantic alarm froze at the parlor threshold. Their expressions mirrored absolute bewilderment at the grotesque tableau unfolding violently on the floor. The head butler forced his way past the onlookers, losing his trademark stoicism upon witnessing 47 of the wealthiest elites convulsing across the imported Persian rugs. His gaze locked onto the culinary architect, waiting perfectly still beside the unfolding nightmare. A dark clarity in the chef's stare caused the veteran worker to recoil immediately. He muttered a question of disbelief, his horrified whisper nearly drowned out by the agonizing wheezes of perishing elites. He demanded to know the truth. The quiet man returned the stare with chilling serenity, revealing the decades of unspoken agony, buried fury, and absolute resolve that forged this catastrophic evening of cosmic reckoning. "I delivered pure justice." He addressed the supervisor with a calm, piercing tone that cut through the agonizing chaos. He confessed to simmering this recipe for 28 years. The preparation began the day those iron shackles locked shut. This evening they simply consumed the darkness they had forced down our throats. The gathered workforce inched forward, features twisted with a blend of pure dread and stark clarity upon grasping the magnitude of this covert operation. A few recoiled in sheer panic. They knew a brutal vengeance would fall upon the entire property once law enforcement uncovered it. Yet several onlookers harbored a silent awe, viewing a man who successfully executed the exact phantom rebellion they had only visualized in secret. The architect of this massacre remained entirely devoid of terror, monitoring each gasping breath. Biological functions collapsed entirely beneath the weight of the floral toxins. He felt the invisible presence of his ancestors watching. Ethereal harmonies of freedom echoed through the luxurious parlor, resonating in a psychological frequency accessible only to his mind. Generations had suffered in silence for this exact reckoning. They observed as helpless phantoms while these oppressors accumulated wealth and secured legacies. The ghosts could ultimately find peace. The plantation owner stubbornly fought his fate. His physical endurance was fortified by decades of elite nourishment and premium healthcare utterly withheld from his captive workforce. Yet no aristocratic vitality could filter the lethal botanical concentration surging through his bloodstream like molten acid. The dying patriarch attempted an utterance, likely a final threat or plea. Crimson fluid bubbled past his lips instead, marking the absolute failure of his anatomy against the meticulously brewed concoction crafted upon his own warm stove. The fading gaze locked onto the quiet chef across the room, broadcasting a sudden, horrifying comprehension of the trap that had snapped shut. He finally knew his executioner. The poisoner demanded his victim possess absolute clarity regarding the architect of demise. The patriarch would expire agonizingly aware that his so-called property had reached right through their invisible shackles, seizing the violent accountability entirely denied to them within the realm of life. He whispered a specific woman's name. The quiet dedication was meant exclusively for dying ears. He named the countless victims erased by ruthless economic ambition. He explicitly detailed the fatal psychological consequences of driving human souls into an inescapable corner. It was the price for ignoring that underneath subjugation beat living hearts perfectly capable of catastrophic wrath. The aristocrat worked his jaw silently, his throat muscles entirely locked by toxicity. Yet his panicked stare broadcasted absolute profound psychological defeat. Beyond stark terror lay profound clarity, a devastating admission that his captives harbored the exact same emotional depths and vengeful instincts he reserved strictly for his own kind. His ultimate seconds ticked slowly away. He was aggressively forced to confront the absolute humanity of the individuals he had systematically commodified. He swallowed the sheer gravity of his cruelty, alongside the unquestionable fairness of the lethal payback, claiming his fading life. The neurological spark extinguished completely, and the undisputed king of the vast estate permanently checked out alongside his wealthy peers. An eerie quiet descended upon the grand parlor, interrupted exclusively by the shallow gasps of the final lingering survivors. Their failing bodies waged a hopeless war against the deadly floral poison, ensuring their bitter demise before the hour concluded. The architect of this massacre remained motionless amid the slaughter, finding absolute serenity for the first time in 28 agonizing years now that his gruesome masterpiece was finished. Cosmic justice was achieved. 47 ruthless flesh merchants would never shatter another family, strip another soul of their humanity, or wield absolute authority to casually extinguish innocent human lives. Ethereal phantoms slowly dissolved into the shadows, their transparent silhouettes vanishing as their ultimate vengeance was realized. The spectral vision of his beloved wife drifted closer, radiating profound affection and fierce pride as her intangible fingers brushed against his skin in a phantom embrace he deeply felt. She confirmed their nightmare was over. Her delicate tone weakened as she readied herself to cross into whatever mysterious sanctuary lay beyond this earthly realm. She assured him the brutal toll was exacted, guaranteeing these monsters could harm no one else from the grave. He had executed a dark justice they never could achieve in life, forcing their tormentors to suffer as the surrounding apparitions bowed in grim validation. The shadowy figures raised their murmuring tones into a haunting chorus of emancipation before completely dissolving from earthly sight. These restless souls finally observed the profound vindication stolen from them while breathing, watching their killers face a brutal punishment no mortal magistrate would ever decree. Eternal slumber was now possible, since the terrifying scales were leveled. Every gruesome ledger was closed through a celestial calculation bypassing corrupt human legislation. When the final apparition vanished into darkness, the stoic avenger strolled toward the culinary quarters, casually bypassing the twisted corpses of tyrants who formerly controlled the breathing rights of his enslaved community. Silence followed. The remaining domestic captives clustered in sheer terror, utterly paralyzed by the debate of whether to revere him as a savior or surrender him to the looming lawmen. Inquisitors would undoubtedly arrive seeking grim explanations, yet the poisoner possessed zero inclination to flee or evade the inevitable fallout of his deadly crusade. His horrifying yet entirely righteous objective was flawlessly executed. He served a fatal judgment upon elite monsters who believed themselves untouchable, proving that certain atrocities demanded merciless retribution and absolute destruction. His impending mortal fate mattered little against the terrifying universal equilibrium he meticulously engineered from the shadows of the cooking hearth. Morning light crept across the sprawling estate on October 15th. 1853 brought a horrific sunrise that would spark hushed legends among captive communities for endless decades. 47 corpses rested motionless within the opulent parlor, their luxurious formal wear instantly transformed into ghastly burial garments. Each twisted visage remained permanently locked in sheer panic, silently testifying to the excruciating torment they suffered during death. An extravagant autumnal banquet intended to glorify their bloody wealth had morphed into a terminal feast. The peak of their arrogant supremacy twisted into ultimate annihilation. The solitary mastermind rested peacefully upon the rear stairs, while early morning beams washed the blood-soaked property in brilliant hues of deep red. He observed the escalating panic with the chilling tranquility of a seasoned artist admiring his completed macabre life masterpiece. Frantic domestic workers sprinted wildly between the decaying mansion and their shacks, desperately whispering the terrifying details of the slaughter. Laborers congregated in secretive circles, murmuring softly as their wide eyes gleamed with a chaotic blend of sheer terror and a dangerously unspoken optimism. He knew the armed lawmen were coming. Frantic messengers were galloping away to retrieve the local sheriff. They urgently sought any available physician to analyze the grisly massacre and explain the sudden extermination of the wealthiest autocrats in the territory. These investigators would dissect the crime scene with an intensity fueled by pure horror, yet the poisoner remained completely apathetic. The authorities could scour for clues, interrogate the innocent, and blindly blame foreign activists all they desired. The actual reality was immensely less complicated, yet infinitely darker than they imagined. A juvenile captive cautiously tiptoed forward, his trembling expression reflecting the same profound disorientation plaguing every enslaved worker since the discovery. The frightened child addressed the elder in a breathless murmur that practically vanished into the quiet dawn. He desperately questioned their immediate fate, the destiny of the cursed estate, and the brutal punishment awaiting the solitary cook. The architect of death met the gaze of the boy with ancient wisdom, fully recognizing that this trembling child was currently surviving the violent collapse of a dark empire and the brutal dawn of an entirely new era. He calmly explained the future. History dictates that absolute chaos, blinding panic, and vicious fury inevitably erupt whenever wicked tyrants are finally forced to bleed. Vengeful men will aggressively hunt for a scapegoat to torture. Yet this immense sacrifice will undeniably spark genuine, earth-shattering transformation, breaking decades of isolated tradition. The initial wave of uniformed investigators breached the property lines well before the midday sun. A grim assembly of local lawmen and medical professionals gathered to examine the catastrophic slaughter that had recently decimated Mississippi plantation aristocracy. Sheriff William Morrison arrived promptly. His personal financial empire relied entirely upon the very brutal institution that Samuel had just violently dismantled. He analyzed the drawing room massacre with pure dread and mounting fury while observing Dr. Edmund Carlisle. The physician evaluated the fallen corpses using the chilling methodical exactness of an elite death investigator. His horrifying conclusions were absolute because they revealed that all 47 victims perished from intentional poisoning. Lethal cardiac glycosides had completely flooded their bloodstreams and violently forced their hearts to seize and their lungs to shut down. The deadly venom was covertly introduced directly into their banquet. The assassin laced the dinner courses with a chilling accuracy, requiring deep awareness of their eating rituals to prove outside rebels were entirely innocent. Dr. Carlisle delivered this verdict to the gathered detectives, while his tone strained under the horrific gravity of his findings. This massacre was an internal job executed by a phantom who held total access to the kitchens. The perpetrator held intricate knowledge of the feast and anticipated precisely what these masters would consume and the exact hour they dined. Sheriff Morrison immediately locked his gaze upon the captive quarters as a terrifying realization washed over his face regarding the immense slaughter. One of Whitmore's personal captives had meticulously engineered this bloodbath. The assassin displayed a terrifying genius and strategic brilliance that utterly shattered the racist doctrines upholding the foundation of their aristocratic world. These profound consequences were world-shattering. This reality threatened the detective work and the entire brutal system of slavery, which relied completely upon the false myth of intellectual weakness. Yet undeniable forensic clues pointed straight toward the captive laborer cabins. The gathered detectives remained deeply hesitant to embrace the terrifying logical reality of their own discoveries. The terrifying concept that human property possessed the genius and ruthless willpower to permanently annihilate 47 of the state elite leaders felt impossibly radical to accept. Such dark truth suggested a dangerous capacity for rebellion among the captives that would obliterate the bedrock of their cruel institution. Samuel offered zero resistance or denial when the armed authorities finally descended upon him. He waited peacefully inside the sweltering kitchen where he had toiled for 28 agonizing years. His battered hands still displayed the brutal scars of endless grease burns and deep lacerations from heavy butcher blades. He absorbed their furious accusations with the chilling, dignified grace of a warrior who had finally delivered his brutal truth. He confessed calmly when the sheriff interrogated him about the lethal feast and admitted he pulverized toxic oleander flowers and stirred the deadly dust into every single serving. He calmly explained that the meticulous venom preparation consumed his entire night to guarantee that every single oppressor swallowed a generous, deadly portion of their righteous vengeance. This chilling admission radiated pure terror through the gathered deputies. It validated their darkest nightmares, while completely shattering their arrogant foundational beliefs regarding the psychological depth of the human beings they brutally enslaved. This massacre provided terrifying evidence that captive men harbored an identical genius for elaborate tactical warfare. They possessed deep emotional complexities and a fierce familial loyalty that their cruel oppressors arrogantly claimed as entirely their own. Sheriff Morrison interrogated him aggressively while his trembling voice betrayed a volatile cocktail of furious anger and deep-seated terror. The lawman questioned the horrific motive by arguing that the patriarch had provided daily rations and garments alongside an elevated status within the grand estate. He insisted Samuel enjoyed superior privileges and demanded to know why such supposed benevolence was brutally answered with a calculated massacre. Samuel released a laugh as sharp as a freezing tempest that felt heavily burdened with 28 agonizing years of silent captivity. His chilling tone held the profound sorrow of a father who witnessed his loved ones obliterated by the effortless sadism of his self-proclaimed owners. He mocked the word benevolence with venomous irony and challenged the sheriff to hear the true reality of his master grace. He demanded they visit the scorched earth, where the patriarch maliciously incinerated his wife merely for educating captive children. He offered to point out the auction block where his boy was traded like livestock, before detailing the haunting night his beautiful daughter vanished forever after catching the predator's lustful gaze. The sheriff stumbled backwards because he felt physically battered by the heavy gravity of his chilling words. All color drained from his skin as he finally faced the suffocating agony concealed beneath the estate's false veil of polite southern wealth. The childish illusion of loyal servants and gracious lords that had brainwashed his entire southern upbringing was violently shattering. This profoundly dark reality revealed the catastrophic, inescapable bloodbath that inevitably follows when living human souls are brutally commodified as mere livestock. Samuel declared they earned their gruesome fate. His tone remained impossibly cold and resolute, even as quiet tears of absolute vindication streamed down his scarred face to condemn every single master. Their massive fortunes rose from stolen sweat, their lavish comfort strictly financed by utter human devastation. The powerful falsely assumed they could peddle humans like cattle, butcher domestic bonds for profit, and ruthlessly grind physical bodies into dust. They tossed aside shattered souls like rusted tools until the darkness proved otherwise. When midnight struck, those oppressors finally understood. Their victims bled identically. Deep inside lived an equal reservoir of affection and fury, driven by relentless, bloody retribution. The ensuing courtroom spectacle rapidly evolved into the most fiercely debated legal war in Mississippi history. This gripping drama destroyed the hypocritical core of a brutal empire. It shattered the comforting myth that chained laborers somehow lacked the chilling brilliance required to execute complex, strategic terror. A lone attorney emerged. Marcus Beaumont was a young advocate, haunted by severe moral conflicts. He secretly despised the very systemic cruelty his upbringing demanded. He boldly claimed this horrific violence was entirely unavoidable. The litigator framed the massacre as a natural reaction to intense systemic dehumanization. The impassioned lawyer commanded the silent room during his closing. His resonant tone echoed chillingly through a suffocating gallery, where morbidly fascinated locals watched this unparalleled spectacle. Sworn witnesses have painted a terrifying portrait. They claimed the defendant flawlessly orchestrated the most devastating toxic massacre imaginable. The prosecution presented undeniable proof, highlighting his dark, encyclopedic mastery of lethal foliage. He supposedly measured agonizing death using flawless logic. This mastermind systematically laced banquet dishes to guarantee total, inescapable annihilation. A suffocating silence fell as the litigator paused. He forced the prejudiced panel to mentally digest a terrifying paradox, making them reckon with the undeniable cognitive brilliance of a chained man. I propose that plotting this flawless massacre demands immense brilliance. It demands profound schooling. This deep psychological complexity shatters the comforting lies used to defend a barbaric institution. If we accept this captive possessed the dark genius necessary to construct such a labyrinthine slaughter, we must concede everything. We must acknowledge his heart held profound devotion toward his bride. He felt the agonizing loss of his offspring. The crushing gravity of constant abuse naturally pushed him toward catastrophic vengeance. Yet the impaneled peers were exclusively powerful landowners, enriched by chains. They remained psychologically incapable of digesting the terrifying truth hidden behind the defendant's intricate, bloody rebellion. Validating the cognitive brilliance of a captive meant completely obliterating the fragile bedrock holding up their universe. Such an admission would forcefully confirm their lifetime complicity in pure sadism. It would expose their brutal reign as an ugly exercise in tyrannical greed. The final judgment was entirely scripted by the invisible cultural and financial currents dominating society. It happened in 1853. The captive caught a swift conviction for capital homicide and received the noose. Officials slated his grim swinging for early December. Yet, while the magistrates finalized his doom, a shadow lingered. The condemning panel remained silently haunted by the dark philosophical horrors his defiance unleashed. They could no longer ignore the chilling humanity of their prisoners, or the vile depravity breeding such monsters. Rumors of this spectacular act of venomous retaliation ignited the southern labor camps like dry brush. A ghostly, untraceable whisper network swiftly transported the chilling narrative across heavily guarded state borders. The violent saga morphed with every recitation. The dark legend acquired supernatural weight, infiltrating neighboring estates. It ignited fierce hope while striking primal dread, proving that bloody rebellion was entirely achievable. This dark victory proved that the most untouchable tyrants remained fundamentally exposed to lethal, unrelenting willpower. Deep inside the cabins, he became an immortal legend. Captives breathed his name with religious awe beside flickering hearths. They celebrated his grim triumph in concealed hollows where stolen moments allowed forbidden exchanges. Haunting melodies were quietly penned to immortalize his lethal masterpiece. Singers disguised their hymns of vengeance beneath harmless religious parables. A rising generation destined to witness liberation absorbed his dark tale as a crucial masterclass in defiance. They understood the absolute necessity of striking back, regardless of the catastrophic personal toll it required. Simultaneously, his phantom legacy operated as a terrifying alarm bell for wealthy landowners across the territory. It offered a chilling realization. Their delicate security completely relied on the victims continuing to tolerate the chains without retaliation. The 47 corpses dragged from Magnolia Plantation violently shattered the foolish illusion of perpetual submissiveness. Underneath a thin veil of forced obedience, a bottomless ocean of lethal ingenuity patiently waited to boil over. Paranoia triggered a massive escalation of armed surveillance across 3 states. The culinary staff faced intense, unblinking scrutiny. Panicked aristocrats hired human guinea pigs to sample high-profile banquets. They rapidly established draconian barricades around any fertile grounds, harboring potentially venomous vegetation. Yet, all the frantic barricades failed to cure the horrific systemic disease the mastermind had diagnosed. You simply cannot permanently suffocate the volatile human spirit. It showcased the inescapable reality that those crushed under tyranny would inevitably claw their way back using whatever weapons they could scrounge. Samuel passed his final days locked inside the bleak jail cell, radiating the exact same chilling composure that defined his terrifying confession. Those traveling to glimpse the phantom who had paralyzed the southern aristocracy with his lethal banquet did not discover the mindless monster they anticipated. Instead, they faced a remarkably silent and profoundly reflective soul who articulated the dark forces pushing him towards such a ruthless reckoning. He offered zero apologies for the slaughter, harboring only a quiet sorrow that it required such catastrophic bloodletting to expose the horrific suffering of his people. He firmly stated to one visitor that he took no joy in extinguishing life. A seasoned journalist arrived from New Orleans to profile the massacre architect, to whom Samuel confessed carrying zero shame for his brutal vengeance. He explained his victims squandered their privileged existence, shattering families and pulverizing human souls merely for the sake of greed. They carefully engineered the nightmare, making his vicious retaliation mandatory, and they should have first granted mercy if they desired a peaceful existence. The impending execution lured massive and restless crowds from every dark corner. Morbid onlookers and anxious plantation barons stood together, desperate to watch the final breath of a nightmare that utterly shattered their comfortable illusions. Samuel marched toward the towering gallows with unnerving grace, outright refusing the customary dark hood that would have veiled his piercing gaze. He demanded they look into his eyes, forcing them to forever remember the unyielding humanity they had brutally tried to erase. The haunting sentences slipping from his lips right before the floor vanished would be etched into secret memories for countless generations. He declared that his devastating strike for liberation would violently echo across history, celebrating that the monstrous masters were finally gone. Yet the broken souls they attempted to crush remained standing, fiercely fighting for the divine justice belonging to every living creature on earth. The chilling days immediately following his hanging were choked by a suffocating paranoia, poisoning the wealthy plantation districts across 3 southern states. Arrogant enslavers who once slept soundly now lay awake, terrified of their very own kitchen staff. Their personal house servants watched silently. Paranoia set in as they realized even trusted workers secretly nursed an agonizing hatred profound enough to spark catastrophic slaughter. The psychological terror unleashed by the plantation massacre radiated far beyond the 47 men who choked to death that October. However, the monumental historical weight of his cold-blooded retaliation remained shrouded in mystery until the turbulent years that rapidly approached. The legend of the Phantom Cook transformed into undeniable proof that shackled victims possessed the exact same lethal intellect as the tyrants holding the whip. This psychological earthquake cracked the Southern foundation, fueling an ideological shift, paving the bloody path toward brutal warfare and widespread liberation. Northern abolitionists fiercely weaponized the chilling case, displaying it as horrific evidence that absolute bondage rotted the souls of both tyrant and captive. They argued this horrific environment forged a suffocating cruelty, inevitably triggering spectacular and fatal violence. The legendary Frederick Douglass openly investigated the grim massacre details within his own powerful writings. He argued with piercing logic that this devastating revenge perfectly illustrated the suicidal foolishness of keeping breathing humans locked in eternal captivity. Douglass challenged his readers to deeply analyze the horror, demanding they question exactly what dark despair pushed a man to execute such catastrophe. He asked if it was born from a natural barbarism, or if it was the explosive result of demonic torture inflicted by men claiming to own his soul. To any honest mind, the grim truth was glaringly obvious. The institution of slavery acts as a rotting disease, guaranteeing a vicious loop of bloodshed ending only by completely eradicating human captivity. The entire plantation economy trembled violently as the sinister reality of his vengeance sank into their bones. Frightened insurance syndicates immediately jacked up their premiums to shield wealthy captors from identical stealthy massacres. Terrified that the myth of the submissive captive was shattered, paranoid landowners poured massive fortunes into fortifying sprawling estates against the hidden shadows. Simultaneously, other nervous aristocrats began wondering if the bloody profits of forced labor were truly worth the agonizing mental torture of expecting a knife in the dark. Deep inside the wooden shacks, this triumphant legacy thrived through quiet hymns and hushed fables. His grim narrative was fiercely guarded in secretive whispers, slipping quietly from one generation to the very next. Youngsters brought into this world long after his death were raised on the legend, learning that lethal retaliation remained a viable weapon against absolute hell. His cold willingness to murder sparked an underground rebellion spanning from quiet sabotage to spectacular uprisings. Every defiant act added dangerous weight to a boiling pressure cooker that would inevitably blow the iron shackles of captivity straight to pieces. When the bloody civil conflict erupted, it utterly validated his prophecy that human trafficking would trigger its own violent apocalypse through the fleeing masses. They served as fierce soldiers and cunning spies against their former captors. They danced in the streets with unbridled ecstasy when the glorious news of total liberation finally reached their weary communities. These warriors stood as the spiritual heirs of the silent cook, who chillingly administered cold justice using nothing but toxic flower dust and unquenchable rage. Over 150 years have passed since that chilling autumn night. Yet the shadow of this man remains a towering monument to absolute human resilience. What he did serves as a dark reminder that absolute tyranny, regardless of its suffocating grip, cannot suffocate the violent craving for liberation buried deep inside the soul. Those 47 brutal overseers who took their final breaths on that cursed estate falsely believed their empire of agony was entirely invincible. However, those arrogant men fatally underestimated the quiet, seething rage of a broken captive. He completely rejected the role forced upon him within a ruthless machine fueled by human suffering. Standing in the pitch-black shadows of that southern kitchen, pulverizing toxic flowers into fine dust, this broken chef could not have foreseen his grim vengeance sparking a massive wave of liberation. This was never the calculated strike of a political mastermind. Instead, it was the raw fury of a shattered husband mourning his slaughtered bride and a desperate father mourning his stolen offspring. Nevertheless, this deeply personal vendetta seamlessly morphed into a monumental uprising, ultimately shattering the literal shackles holding millions in endless agony. His profoundly disturbing footprint leaves us wrestling with the terrifying reality that true liberation frequently demands acts of horrifying moral ambiguity. This chilling narrative forces society to stare directly into the darkest aspects of rebellion. It brutally interrogates the boundaries of ethics and highlights the devastating toll exacted when total subjugation clashes with the hunger for autonomy. Simultaneously, this grim tale provides undeniable evidence that no dictatorial regime is immune to destruction. Regardless of its vast wealth or brutal tactics, authority can never permanently crush the innate human demand for basic respect. That bloody slaughter in the fall of 1853 proves that human destiny is forged not merely by wealthy elites, but through the terrifying bravery of victims who refuse to bleed in silence. The authorities ultimately silenced this vengeful chef with a hangman's noose. However, his phantom continued to breathe life into the souls of countless captives, harboring dangerous fantasies of escape. His ghost marched alongside radicals dismantling systemic slavery and stood beside every northern soldier bleeding for the radical idea of universal human equality. This deeply unsettling account commands us to recognize that liberation is never voluntarily surrendered by ruthless tyrants. Independence must be violently extracted, fiercely defended, and paid for in blood by those visionary enough to crave a brighter tomorrow. That phantom chef who delivered death through pulverized botanical toxins comprehended this savage reality with absolute clarity. Consequently, his lethal retaliation reverberates through the decades, establishing the cold truth that cosmic balance inevitably demands a brutal reckoning. Where do you stand on this chilling piece of history? Was this catastrophic act of vengeance a righteous strike against a monstrous institution? Perhaps you suspect a less violent avenue toward salvation existed for this devastated man and his captive brethren? Should this dark chronicle of rebellion grip your imagination? Please hit that subscribe button and tap the alert icon. Each passing week, our investigations unearth the buried secrets of individuals who waged war against overwhelming tyranny. We drag forgotten narratives out of the shadows and into the light. If this terrifying tale of defiance struck a nerve, please pass this investigation along to your friends. Assist our team in broadcasting the names of these discarded revolutionaries who secretly altered human history. Their unyielding grit and refusal to bow down to cruelty continues to define the absolute pursuit of retribution.